and he is now at the New School. His latest book, which he has a copy of, John Maynard Keynes. Please welcome Professor Davidson. His topic is reforming the world's money in the absence of a supranational government. And as we were sitting back there, he said that Professor Martin's talk was a perfect tie-in with what he wants to say. Please welcome.
Thank you. As I sat there listening to the last speaker, several things came to my mind. First of all, last October, I was up at Harvard, and there was a conference on the future of liberalism, okay? And I gave a talk entitled, "Are we making any progress towards a good, civilized economic society?" I had written a book with my son called Economics for a Civilized Society. And I did point out, and I think the speaker or the previous speaker, that from 1945 to 1973, we had a golden age of economic development with the same multinationals and central banks and so on. The economy grew in per capita income, not only in the developed nations, but also in the less developed nations. In the developed nations, it was about 4.5%, 5% per year. Okay. In the less developed nations, it was about 2.5% to 3% per capita growth, and that was the lower rate of growth was not because their real GDP didn't grow; it was because they had higher population growth. So that sort of diluted the thing. And something happened in the early 70s, which changed the system around. Now, I've written this book, which has just come out, on John Maynard Keynes, because Keynes believed that that there were several problems. You know, he didn't call it capitalism; he called it a monetary entrepreneurial economy, and he believed that, like democracy, this monetary was not perfect, but that it nevertheless was the best system that people had devised for developing economically, and economics, after all, is the essence of human, what should I say? I hate to use the word satisfaction, but of human welfare. If you don't have goods to eat, clothe yourself, shelter yourself, you can't have very much economic welfare, no matter how socialist the state. And one of the problems, of course, and the other speaker pointed it out, was the Soviet Union, supposedly a socialist state, really was pretty nasty to its population. On the other hand, the Chinese, which are supposedly a socialist state, has adopted many of the capitalist institutions and are doing very well in the last half a dozen or more years for their population. They still have 300 million people who are living in poverty and et cetera, but things have improved. Now, Keynes recognized one further thing, which I thought, to plug my book. Larry Elliott, the economic advisor of The Guardian, wrote about this book. Global imbalances, the unshackling of capital, the precarious state of modern capitalism. Rarely has the world of economics been in more need of the thoughts of John Maynard Keynes. Although Keynes is no longer with us, this book is the next best thing. Paul Davidson is the leading, well, I shouldn't read my own, but is the leading expert on Keynes, and his book should be read by anybody who wants to understand the world as it is, rather than the economic textbook says it ought to be. And the last speaker was really attacking orthodox economics, which tells you how the economics ought to be. You know, this maximum satisfaction and so on and so forth. It's not the way the world is. And Keynes recognized there was at least two major faults of the monetary equilibrium system, entrepreneurial system that we live in. And one of them was the inability to maintain persistent full employment, and the second was the arbitrary and inequitable distribution of income and wealth. And many of the people sitting in this room, particularly the second one, is a problem for them. The third one, and one that Ken Bonsack, who I worked with in the early 1990s, raises the question, which I could put in terms of the present administration, guns versus infrastructure, education, and universal health care, or something of that sort. The point being that the government misallocates whatever resources we have, which the government sector can do something about by buying things and so on, does the wrong things, okay? And Ken's idea was somehow or other to get the states, of course, they still have national guards, but they're not as big. The police we think of as good guys, the military we somehow think of as bad guys, but the states do worry about education more than the federal government does, and worries about infrastructure, et cetera. And so Ken's idea was how can we get, and the states are limited by their fiscal revenue problems. So Ken's idea was how do we get more resources to them, and he had this similar to Steve's idea of somehow getting the monetary system to work so that we get, because in an entrepreneurial market economy, money is the thing that allocates resources. If you got the money, you can buy things, okay? Which, by the way, if you're worried about the textbooks, money doesn't really matter. Money only controls the rate of inflation. If the textbooks have an assumption which is called neutral money, that is, money doesn't affect the real economy at all, it just affects the price level. And of course, people in this room recognize that it's just the opposite. It's not that the price level is the problem, it's allocation of resources, income distribution, wealth distribution, and getting things into what we believe is good for society. Now, I don't want to go into the Ronald Reagan speech about why should we let a bureaucrat know how to spend your income better than you do type of thing. But that's part of the problem. Okay, the second thing I should point out, and again the last speaker reminded me, is if you talk to the mainstream economists, it's an old joke, but I'll use it anyhow. How many mainstream economists who defend the current system does it take to screw in a light bulb?
How many?
None, because the free market will do it. You see. So, but obviously it doesn't. And there is a role for government. Now, even Adam Smith recognized that there was a role for government. He thought of it in terms of national defense. By the way, he also thought of it in education. And the reason for that, and at that time, national governments didn't do much for education. He was a starving professor at Glasgow, and he recognized that his income would improve if somehow the government would spend more money on education. So he believed in education, and he believed in national defense and the enforcement of laws. Our legal system. I mean, that's why we think of policemen as good as opposed to military people who are somehow bad, okay? Because we want people to be civilized, and despite what the last speaker said, there are some people in our society who want to take advantage of other people. Now, Keynes believed that the distribution of income was unfair, arbitrary, and inequitable, he said. But he didn't believe in a purely equitable distribution of income. He believed that you could have some inequalities. For example, a statistic, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, right after the war, the CEO of most major corporations earned between 15 and 20 times what the average worker in his factory does. Currently, CEOs of these major corporations earn 350 times what their average worker does. And that's, why, you see. And I think this bothers people in this room one way or the other, whether they know the actual numbers or statistics. You can see it, you can smell it, so to speak. And what can we do about it? Okay? Huh? What can we do about it? And the answer is, we have a good, as I pointed out, from 1945 to 1975, the economic system, with all its faults, the monetary system, really delivered the goods. The growth of GDP per capita in that period of time was greater than the growth at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which we think of as I have some statistics here in this book, or you can look at on my website for this article I gave at Harvard, which shows, from Garden of Eden till 1770s, the real GDP of the communities didn't grow very much, 1/10% a year or less, and so people weren't much better off at the American Revolution than they had been 200 years earlier. Some people were little, some people weren't, but on average, and something happened in what we call the Industrial Revolution, and that was for the first time the common man, at least some of them, got out of poverty, the atrocious poverty of the serfs and the people who worked in the fields in England and Europe in that period of time. And that's, of course, when the crops failed. Why did everybody come to the United States? Because they could get a GDP per capita which was a little better, not much better. Okay, but suddenly in the Industrial Revolution thing, and we have, I mean, Chicago was full of people who were of Eastern European descent who came here, worked in the steel mills and so on, and had a lot better real standard of living than they had in the old country. But after the Second World War, the greater growth of prosperity for all people, and particularly for the poor, was much better than it had been in the whole history from the Garden of Eden till 1945. So the economy did somehow work pretty well. There are problems. And something happened in 1974 and 75, I won't go into it, but and things have gotten worse since then. We've not made progress, we've retrogressed, and the distribution of income now is equivalent of what it was at the turn of the last century, with the with the robber baron rich and a lot more poor people. All right, let me now move on to the international sector, because we are in a globalized economy whether you like it or not. And the last speaker spoke about a federation of nations and so on and so forth. That's very nice and ideal, but I don't think it's on the political screen. Now, Keynes was worried about this when he came out of the Second World War. We had Bretton Woods, and Keynes was one of the organizers of the Bretton Woods Conference, on how to deal with the international monetary problems, because this had been part of the cause of the terrible economics of the 1930s, and in Europe in 1920s as well as 1930s. Okay, and he developed a certain amount of institutional arrangements and so on, but his scheme, which I won't go into, was shot down by the Americans. There was the Assistant Secretary of Treasury, Henry Dexter White, said that his scheme wouldn't work, and we instead installed the IMF and the World Bank, which was the Harry Dexter White, sort of equivalent to Keynes' scheme. Okay, but, and by the way, it worked for about 25 years. And part of the reason why it worked is Keynes had one further thing in his scheme, which the United States adopted, not for economic reasons, but for political reasons. And here's the problem. Once you have a global, all of these, as far as I can tell, people here who have monetary schemes, they're for the nation's economy. And you still have sovereign nations. But the problem is on the international level. You're going to have trade between nations, and there's a balance of payments problem. Because it's impossible for every nation to export exactly what it equivalent in value of what it imports. And so the problem is some nations are going to run deficits, and some nations are going to run surpluses. And how are the deficit nations? It's like like I'm a pensioner. So I spend more than I earn in terms of at least payroll, because I'm not on anybody's payroll. I still have a pension and so on, and I do get book royalties. But in general, how do I finance it? See? And of course, the answer is, in general, we tell people, well, you have to save while you're working so that you can spend it down. And if you're a good classical economist, you spend, when you take your last breath, you spend your last penny, and so everything works out fine. Well, Keynes pointed out that the problem, what do we do now? The United States has a huge trade deficit. It has since 1981. We're the only nation in the world that continually runs a trade deficit, almost now, 26, 27 years, and live pretty well high on the hog. Why? Because we happen to have a dollar international currency, excuse me, and the world is on a dollar system. But we saw what happened in Argentina, in Ecuador, et cetera. By the way, I was well, I won't talk about Ecuador, but I was down there when they dollarized and told them not to, but they did anyhow. But the problem is the deficit nation, how does it finance a deficit? Well, if it has reserves, it spends the reserves, but sooner or later it runs out of it. Now, after the Second World War, Europe was devastated. It had no political, it had no plant and equipment left and so on. It had to feed its people. How did it do it? Well, the only way to do it was to go to the United States and buy huge amounts of imports. We could produce all this food and equipment to rebuild their factories and so on, and they quickly ran out of reserves. And the free market people would say, well, what do you do when you run out of reserves and you're still running deficits? The answer is tighten your belt, okay? And of course, all that would have done was to force, and there was the Soviet Union on the east who was trying to encourage some of the Europeans to join the Soviet type system. And if you tighten your belt, people in the United States State Department were worried that the European countries would go communist. Okay, so what did we do? We had something called the Marshall Plan, which is almost the equivalent of what we took all these surplus dollars that we had, and we gave them, we didn't lend it to them, we gave it to them free of interest, right? And said, here, spend it. And you know, and so it's like if Lord and Taylor's comes around and sends you in the mail, here's a $50 gift certificate, go out and spend it in Lord & Taylor's. What are you going to do? You're going to go out and run and spend it in Lord & Taylor's. Creates jobs there. Well, what happened was, for the first time after any war, the United States did not have a recession. Despite 8 million men and women who had been in the Army who were being released and entering the labor force. Okay? We had full employment during the war, obviously, of the civilian labor force. These 8 million people were quickly absorbed as our export industries grew, and we provided the goods. So we gained, and the Europeans gained from that. This giving away, so to speak, of our surplus. And the real GDP of the United States continued to grow. So Keynes's point was, whenever we're going to have a balance of payments problem, the trick of the game is to have the creditor nation take on the responsibility of solving the balance of payments difficulties. And they can do it by several ways, and I go through this in the book. I won't go through all of that for you. But the question was, how do you institutionalize this? You have to get some institutions. Here's where I think the previous speaker is right. You have to somehow some international institutions. And Keynes had a supranational central bank who would operate to do this. Every country would have a balance sheet, just like the Federal Reserve under the Monetary Acts being recommended by Steve. Federal Reserve still a clearinghouse. And the central bank would observe who was running up their bank balances and who were running down their bank balances, and then there would be some way of forcing the ones who are running up their balances and not spending money to spend money. Okay, and let me give you a good example where the Chinese have $800 billion worth of U.S. treasuries currently. $800 billion. No other country in the world except Japan has that kind of money. Between the two of them, they own, you know, we have $9 trillion worth of debt. Those two countries alone have almost $1.5 trillion of that. Social Security Fund, by the way, has $2 trillion of surplus as well, so they have a big holder. The Federal Reserve has $800 billion. There are a lot of people who hold treasuries, okay? And so, now why do they hold these treasuries? Just think, and we know about outsourcing. All our good jobs, first in blue collar, went to China, and now white collar jobs are going to China. And that's because of the exchange rate and the fact that Chinese workers are willing to work for 25, 30 cents an hour, okay? And then their manufacturers are also willing to sell lead paint toys, right? And ethanol-laced food and what have you to us. Well, one of the things I pointed out at this Harvard conference, and again, this is when you take the free market people to their crazy extremes. Suppose Chinese put a factory in California, but they were allowed to operate it exactly as in China. So they could have child labor. The workers would have to work 55, 60 hours a week without any occupational safety or conditions, and they were able to pollute the atmosphere. And they would build products for the American market. What would happen? Well, our law, our government law, says you can't trade, right, with a company that uses child labor or pollutes the atmosphere or doesn't meet the occupational safety and health conditions. But as long as they're overseas, this factory, the free market nuts, if I can use that phrase, so it's perfectly all right. See? So obviously there is a role for government controlling the entrepreneur to make sure that he produces products that are not harmful. That's why we have a Pure Food and Drug Administration and all these other administrations. There's always going to be some regulation of entrepreneurial systems to make sure that this greed for all is that, you know, I hate to use the University of Chicago but the free marketeers in the University of Chicago say, well, if these people pollute the atmosphere, people are going to know and they're not going to buy their products. Well, we know that's not the case, you see, so that's why the free market works. Okay, so there's a role for government rules about safety, et cetera, on any production scheme. So we shouldn't worry about that. But the big problem is if you had Steve was successful when he got the Monetary Act here in the United States and somebody got a similar act in England, so on, you'd have pounds versus dollars. Now, and people have financial transactions between the different countries. People in England may be wanting to buy stock in American companies and or real estate. I mean, you saw what happened with the subprime market, even in England, type of thing. How are you going to solve these problems? Because with the exchange rate becomes if you have a fixed, it's the question of fixed versus flexible exchange rate. I'm trying to cover a lot of points, and maybe I'm going too fast. But there's many of you have gone overseas, and the question is, what do you get for your dollar when you go overseas? Well, when the euro was at 82 cents, traveling in Europe was a bargain. Now it's $1.40. It's pretty expensive for the same things. What's the exchange rate? Who keeps the control of the exchange rate, you see? Well, typically, the central bank of a country makes the decision of whether the exchange rate should be fixed or, quote, flexible. There's no central bank that I know of, except the United States, who doesn't have to really worry about it, that says we are going to let the market determine the exchange rate. When the exchange, just take the case of Argentina as an obvious example. The Argentinians had a currency board which fixed the peso to the dollar at 1-to-1. When they ran out of dollars, they could no longer maintain the exchange rate. So what did they do? They didn't let the exchange rate started to fall and then free fall because everybody speculated against the Argentine peso, including Argentinians. If you lived in Argentina and you saw, well, you're a good citizen and all that, but you see the pesos falling 10, 20% over a couple of weeks, what could you do? What should you do to protect yourself and your family? Most obvious thing is you would go and buy U.S. Treasuries. Why U.S. Treasuries as opposed to Eurobond? Because U.S. Treasuries is the most safe haven security in the world. And whenever there's a problem, everybody runs to U.S. Treasuries. That's one of the reasons, and the Chinese are, as I say, have $800 billion of U.S. Treasuries. England, by the way, only has $200 billion, just to give you an idea of the differential. Okay, so as long as the central bank keeps the exchange rate stable, there's very little speculation. And the central bank can do it as long as they have enough foreign reserves. And Keynes's point here was to create a system where if a country was running out of foreign reserves, because it's a double entry bookkeeping system or a clearing system, some other country must be building up reserves. One person's deficit has to be another person's credits. And he had a system which made the creditor solve the problem. In the Marshall Plan, how do we solve the problem? By giving away the credits to the debtors. So okay, and that was fine. That created jobs in the United States. Just think, in the United States now, the Chinese buy about $15 billion a month of U.S. treasuries. Okay, just think if they bought $15 billion worth of U.S. goods a month instead. What would that do? It would create a lot of jobs for Americans. See, if they bought $15 billion worth of cantaloupes, there'd be a lot more jobs for farmers, particularly in California and so on. Okay, so the question is, can we arrange this institution where, because there's going to be a balance of payments problem, we can solve that problem? All right, and Keynes had this, and I have, Keynes had a supranational central bank. I don't believe that it's supranational any more than a supranational government or federation of governments as previous, is politically on the map. I don't think, that's very nice and idealistic, but we have to be practical. If we're going to wait for that to occur, an awful lot of people are going to die of hunger and starvation around the world, and jobs are going to be lost. There's a wonderful book I should remind you to just think about outsourcing to China and Asia. A book by Louis Yucatel called The Disposable Americans. And he looks and he meets with a number of people whose jobs were lost to outsourcing, where the corporation moved their products overseas. For what reason? Because it was cheaper to produce the same kind of goods. And what happens to these families? Very often if there is a married family, it ends up in divorce, sometime in suicide. If they get another job, it's always at a lower wage. The United States government has if you were in an industry, a town where the major industry moves out, they provide funds for retraining. And that's usually the argument. You should retrain, and if you retrain, you're going to get, a high-paying job because college graduates get more than public school, high school graduates, and so on. But it shows that all of these people retrained still couldn't get a better job. There's one wonderful story about a guy who was a vice president of a bank in Connecticut, and the bank was taken over by a foreign, by another bank from another state, and many of the operations were closed down. He was fired. He's a well-educated man from Yale and so on and so forth. He couldn't get another job in the banking industry. He ends up being the Connecticut Tourist Commission. He's at one of these rest stops. He's behind the desk there at the rest stops. Now just think about that. Man was 55 years of age and so on. So if somehow or other we could get him a good job, okay, it would have made a big difference. So we have to have an international, because this is bound to happen in the future. By the way, do you know there are only 14 million jobs left in American manufacturing? You know how many jobs are in state and local government? Over 19 million. So there are more people working in state and local government than all of the manufacturing. We think of America as this big manufacturing industry, right? It's gone. Those jobs are gone. Even if we change the exchange rate, they're not coming back. What can we do? You see, that's the question. Okay, so that's part of the problem. So the next question is, well, why didn't we have a flexible exchange rate? Just let and now, of course, Bush is pushing for this. In previous administrations under Carter, they would push for this. Every time we start losing jobs, says the Japanese ought to raise the yen, the Chinese ought to raise the yuan. There's always some other culprit on the other side who's the problem. And if we do that enough, exports become cheap, so foreigners buy more exports. Imports become dear, so we buy less imports, and the balance of payments matches. Well, it turns out in order for that to occur, there's something called the Marshall-Lerner condition. If you're an economist, you understand that. If not, I'm not even going to bother it. But it turns out that if the Marshall-Lerner condition doesn't exist, then changing the exchange rate only makes the thing worse. And here I can quote Ben Bernanke, who wrote a textbook at the time, and he put it as follows: a fall in the exchange rate tends to reduce the value of net exports, makes things worse. Your export-import deficit gets worse, okay? In the very short run, after consumers and firms have much time to change the quantities of imports bought and exports sold, the Marshall-Lerner condition is more likely to hold. See, that's the condition necessary. And a fall in the exchange rate is likely to lead to an increase in your net exports, the improvement. And when he asked, how long is the long run? He said, oh, maybe a number of years. This is now the head of our Federal Reserve Bank. Okay? So what that says is if you can't count on the exchange rate solving your balance of payments problem, you have, okay, Steve has his monetary system in the United States. A friend, I don't see him from UK, has his monetary system there. You're still going to have this balance of payments problem, and you've got to solve that problem for the economy to work. See? And you can't leave it to the free market of exchange rates. You intend, most of these monetary reforms emasculate the central bank ability to stabilize the exchange rate, even if they could. And so you have to have a solution which works all the time. And Keynes had this solution by saying he had the supranational central bank, which said anytime people run up surpluses in their exports, they have to get rid of them. And they have the resources, the wherewithal to get rid of them. They can get rid of them in one of three ways. They can buy more products from the deficit countries, okay? And by doing that, they get rid of their deficits and create jobs in the deficit countries and allow the deficit countries to work their way out of debt. Because if they sell more, they have more income, they can pay off their debts. He says that's the first way. If for some reason they don't want to buy more cantaloupes or whatever it is that then the second thing is to have them make foreign direct investments, that is build factories and so on in the deficit country. Okay, and therefore create jobs in the construction industry and have a good working plant there which will hire workers. And if either of them don't work, then he said, well, you have to have an institution which will confiscate these extra surpluses by some sort of tax on too high surpluses. Well, the Marshall Plan was basically the equivalent. You didn't have to tax the United States to give it away. The United States recognized for political, not economic reasons to give it away. Now, if you have that kind of system, then you don't have to worry about the international problems. But in the absence of that kind of system, the national monetary systems are going, in a world of globalization, are going to break down. See? And there's nothing you can do about it. For example, I was in Ecuador when they dollarized. What does it mean to dollarize Ecuador? They gave up the peso, and they imported actually Federal Reserve notes, which became the reserves of the country. Well, it's very similar to Steve's argument. First of all, what they had to do. The first thing is, and Steve won't like this, but they had to take, I forget how many billions of dollars of U.S. treasuries, which they were earning interest on. This was Ecuador, a pretty poor country. They were earning interest on, and they had to sell them to the Federal Reserve for Federal Reserve notes. Then they had to pack these notes on a boat, ship it through the Panama Canal to Guayaquil, unload them, and then get them into circulation through the banking system. And of course, since very few people have checking accounts in Ecuador, they were hand to hand, and much of it is agriculture. So what happens to a dollar bill that goes hand to hand? It gets worn out very quickly. So then they'd have to take all the worn out bills, pack them up, ship them on a boat back to Baltimore, to the harbor, to take them over to the Federal Reserve and get new notes printed for the old notes. It's a very expensive proposition. See? So there are problems here, and dollarization isn't the solution to it, which you might say, well, dollarization is the equivalent of everybody having the same currency. But that's not the problem. The problem is you have to solve the problem of imbalances, and you have to have some institution which makes sure that creditor nations give debtor nations the ability to work their way out of debt. Now, can you ignore debt? I don't think so, because part of the enterprise system is a system based on debt. I always used to point out to my students, the mark of a successful business person is how deeply in debt you are. If you can go into a bank and on your signature you can get $100,000, you're not bad. If you can get $500,000 as a loan, boy, you're even better, right? Now, what happened in the subprime market was the people in the banking system went crazy. Why did I'm running over time, so maybe I better.
About 12 minutes.
Okay, let me just say about the subprime. What happened is we allowed the free market to enter. You remember Jimmy Stewart? In the olden days, it happened, what was it? A Good Life, the movie The Good Life. He was an SNL.
It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life. He was an SNL. In the olden days, how do you get a mortgage on your house? You went to an SNL who knew you, knew the neighborhood, and made a loan only because you had character, credit, and collateral. And he was stuck with the loan, so he knew if you defaulted, he was going to have to eat it. We've removed all of these regulations which prevented the Glass-Steagall Act, Regulation Q, and so on and so forth. So now, when a banker makes a loan, a mortgage loan, he's going to get rid of it in 30 days, okay? And he's going to package it up and sell it to an investment banker who's going to then spread it to hedge funds who are going to leverage them to make more money. And that's what, so it doesn't matter how bad the borrower is, get rid of it in 30 days. If he makes the first payment, that's all. And that's why they went to subprime mortgages. Well, let me stop at that point.